I'd like to spend a little bit of time this morning just talking about the need for people in business to jump in. And I'd like to begin doing so with a story. Recently, I was involved in surveying CEOs of global businesses. It was a nice cross-section of different industries and different countries around the world. So we had folks from US, Europe, Asia, Africa, etc. And during one of the interviews, a CEO from a large European insurance company shared a story with me. He said that given the rapidly expanding populations in Asia, particularly in China and India, they need to find new sources of food. And given that Africa has half of the uncultivated arable land left in the planet, it's fast becoming a new supply point for food for other countries around the world. Solidifying this south-to-south trade route, particularly on the eastern coast of Africa in countries like Ethiopia, where there's been billions of dollars of investment in farming. So his company saw this trend and noted the opportunity to insure small to medium-sized farmers in Africa, who for them, they were putting up everything they had in this venture, so they needed to be insured against less than average crop yield, because it not only meant that their business would be in jeopardy, but their entire livelihood would be in jeopardy. So he said he did what he always does in these situations. He went and he found a few of his best and brightest people, and he asked them to take the situation, go model it out, and return with a profile and sort of a pro forma of how to think about risk in this venture and how we should think about the insurance. At the conclusion of that meeting that happened 2 to 3 weeks later in a boardroom there in the company, the CEO shared with me 2 insights he had. The first was that he was unsettled by the fact that he wasn't certain his folks really had a grasp of the variables that create risk, both externalities and things that the farmers do themselves, and really didn't feel as though they had a good grasp on that in this particular situation. So they had plenty of models, they had plenty of information, but did they really understand how this plays out in small farms in Eastern Africa? And the second insight he shared was a little bit more personal. It was quite interesting. He said it was a sense of almost disappointment in himself. And he said, I also felt that I wasn't able to help my team frame the problem adequately. And he said, this is something I do normally, and I'm quite good at it, and it's something I take very seriously as my role as CEO, helping others to frame things so they can go analyze them. And he said it caused him to think about the following insight. He said, even our ability to ask good questions is bound by our worldview. And he went on to say, in a world that's changing so dramatically, and in patterns we haven't seen before, can any of us running businesses really rely on our current worldview? So instead of going back to the boardroom and trying to sort this out, they came up with what I thought was quite a novel solution. They actually chose to buy and operate a small farm in the area, right in the center of all the other farms. By doing so, they engaged the context, they actually lived the problems, right? And they got a type of knowledge you only get through lived experience, not facts and figures in the boardroom. And through this lived experience, they start to understand not only what happens in different parts of the world, including there, but how it happens, and more importantly now in the unfamiliar, why it happens, right? So they can actually put better models together. Quick footnote on this story, they also had one unintended positive consequence that came from choosing this route, and that was that their farm became a source of best practices for many of the other farms in the area. So farmers would come to their farm, learn different things that they could apply back at their own farm, further de-risking the farms they in fact insured. So they never planned on that, but engaging in this way actually furthered the cause by not only knowing more, but actually being a place where many could know more. So the other thing that he had shared at the conclusion of this story was the following. And he said, this is a story that exemplifies many things that they've got going on. He said, in a world that's changing rapidly and in ways we haven't seen before, he said, we have to stop our blind belief in models. And this is sort of insightful for an insurance company, I thought, who always, the weapon of choice when encountering the unfamiliar is a more advanced model. It's the thing you bring to this fight, right, as an insurance company. But I also find it to be emblematic of conversations we're having with a number of people who are running businesses around the world. Basically what they're saying is, The world has changed, haven't quite seen this one before. The models aren't working. And we actually have to find new ways to do this because the rules have changed. And in many ways, the rules have changed. Over the past couple years, we've actually moved from an old world that was characterized by big changes, but then those big changes were followed by long periods of relative stability. So think agrarian to industrial revolution, right? Enormous change, changed everything about the way we work and live. But once we got through that, you could count on that paradigm, if you will, lasting for 70 to 100 years. You had some predictability around that, no matter where you were in the world. Think now, we actually are not in the same pattern any longer. We've moved from an era where we actually had big changes followed by long periods of stability to now much more frequent disruptive changes with a lot less stability. So one could ask themselves the question, which we did when we started some of this research, is this just another big change, and can we take a deep breath because a long period of stability will follow, or is the pattern different? And the answer is the pattern is different. As a colleague and a thought leader in this area, John Seely Brown, says, someone we've been working with on this dilemma, he characterized it as, we're moving from an era of equilibrium to a new normal of constant disequilibrium, and he and many others believe that it's this shorter, faster, disruptive pattern we'll see for the next 20 to 50 years. So given that, this actually ushers in a new set of challenges for any of us running businesses these days. The changes are now coming at us with a greater variety, volume, and velocity than ever before. And we don't have the time nor the practical means to take in all that's happening before we actually have to act. It's like navigating in the rapids. You've got to navigate it in the moment, but the moment continues to change. And as it does, so does the paradigm shift for us leading organizations. We move from an era where we had long periods of stability and more predictability, so what you did was rely on your analytics, to a period now where it's we're going to be much more reliant on our awareness. So we move from an era where we accumulated, analyzed a lot of information and planned, so he who could amass the most and have the best plan won, to a period now where the advantage now comes from being in the flow. He who can engage, experiment, and create new knowledge, real time, in unknown situations we haven't seen before, is going to be the source of advantage. Now that's all well and good, but for any of us, it requires some changes for those of us who are leading organizations around the world, right? And these sort of changes come in two forms. I tried to simplify them as much as possible. On one hand, there's always a change in the way we think. Our mindset, our orientation we bring to the world and we bring to the world of business. And the other is a change in action. So let's take the mindset piece first. This is a substantial, not an incremental change. And with any substantial change always involves challenging some deeply held beliefs of the previous period. One such belief we now need to put on the table and challenge, that's related to the theme of this conference, is this notion that when we encounter the unfamiliar and the complex, we de-risk that by analyzing, planning, and removing as much uncertainty before we act, right? Old paradigm. Worked pretty well in a long period of relative stability and known challenges. Now, in a period of fast change, emergent challenges, and time matters. Everybody's moving quickly these days, right? Nobody's waiting for you to figure out what the problem is. The moment you take a little longer, somebody's in front of you. So speed counts. It is that very managerial paradigm that actually creates more risk than moving quicker with incomplete information. So that's the challenge for us as leaders. Now, any of us can take this on board pretty quickly, and we could, if I passed out a multiple choice test and said, what's the right answer to this living in this new world, we'd all get the right answer. But knowing and doing, we know, are two different things, right? So we know the world has changed, but we don't always do what now needs to be done. And the reason for that, as Srini Pillai, a neuroscientist we've been working with, points out, and he said that times of uncertainty and disruptive change create conditions often interpreted as threats by our brain. Under fear and stress, the brain will default to the old way of doing things because we are wired for habits. So we know the world's changed. We can pass that multiple choice test. However, we still reach back when encountering something unfamiliar. What we still want to do is analyze, plan, de-risk before we move, right? So we have to now overcome this in a different way. The good news is the brain is also wired for learning. And so the way we're likely as leaders to learn our way through this is to act our way into a new way of thinking, not think our way into a new way of acting. It's going to require us to catch ourselves when we're actually feeling that instinct to go to the old habit and to practice new habits. And that way the brain gets rewired in the same way. The new habit we're suggesting is jumping in with just enough information to guide you, but not so much that it binds you. That's just enough so you start to move in the right direction, but not so much that it encumbers you to actually act and adapt to what you're finding. You don't want to make the plan more important than the reality, and your ability to adapt to the reality jeopardized by the fact that you thought the reality was going to be different. So it's just enough information to move in the right direction, but not too much that it's going to bind you to act and adapt to what you find. Second critical adjustment around actions. So if you thought about, we now know that we have to jump in earlier, potentially with less complete information and take on a little bit more risk. That now puts a premium on our ability to make sense real time of what we're now seeing and process and use that, in a way that's much more valuable. So philosopher Carl Wick defines sense-making as following. He said, sense-making describes how we structure the unknown in order to be able to act in it. And Wick in his genius went on and said that sense-making is the interplay between action and interpretation. People learn about situations by acting in them and then seeing what happens. Like children, right? For whom much of the world is unfamiliar, they always kick off their learning loop by doing something, right? They go act, they see what happens, they then make sense of what's allowed, what's not allowed, where you can push the boundaries, where you can't push the boundaries. And my God, I've been struck even this morning, if we could ever bottle some of the discovery and optimism of the kids we saw this morning, we'd all be a lot better off in business, huh? Just really, really, really amazing. Anyway, there's a couple things here. The second one is, it's the exact thing the executive from our insurance company was looking for. He's sitting in the boardroom having a conversation about the other side of the world and the way things are changing, and they're bringing him models and facts and figures, and what he's looking for is exactly a way to structure the unknown. That was an unknown situation for them, so they could act in it. And secondly, he was looking for that richly textured knowledge that comes from acting in a situation, interpreting, and then actually understanding how things work, right? It's not you want to know more about just what happens, you want to know how and why it happens. And in a world now where we're in constant disequilibrium, this notion of just getting type 1 information, which has a shorter lifespan, compared to type 2 information about sense making, the kind you get from real life sense making, is very different. I travel globally for business on a regular basis, and so I probably do what any of us would do if you were taking a trip. I always spend some time before I'm going to a new country and read about it, understand the political situation, some of the social things going on, spend a lot of time in the economics, not only about the country, but also about the economics of the industry that the company I may be visiting and working with, how those things play out. And I find it always to be helpful and gives me a sense of confidence, at least a little bit as you start the journey and some things going on. You can at least be contextually relevant. While relevant, I actually find that to be vastly different from the knowledge I get from walking the streets and navigating daily life in a place, right? Or working with local people to solve real problems in a context, in their context, not a context that I've imagined it would be. Or negotiating with someone from halfway around the world with a completely different worldview and a different set of social and business norms. I mean, it's that kind of knowledge, again, that we're talking about, that if we're now living in a world that is less familiar to us, in changing in patterns we haven't seen, is less predictable, the facts and figures are going to be good to warm up, but we're going to need much more of this highly textured knowledge that comes from real-time sense-making. because it not only gives us, when we're in the unknown, it not only gives us a little bit of a top-up on our worldview, but actually helps us to expand it greatly and see things that we hadn't seen before so we can act in them more efficiently and effectively. So this sense-making, as we see for leaders, is best applied in this disequilibrium through a process we're calling successive approximation. We've borrowed this from the world of mathematics, not from the world of psychology. In mathematics, it basically means a result that is not necessarily exact, but it's within the limits of accuracy required for a given purpose. In a world that's rapidly changing, none of us actually know what the right answer will be. So you want to actually move towards it through a series of approximations until you move towards the right answer. That's sort of the mathematical principle, if you will, when you're moving in the unknown. We've borrowed that and shared the following definition. So for leaders, acting and sense-making through successive approximation is the ability to gather just enough information to make a decision and take an action that moves us in the right direction while preserving greater optionality for future moves. So we know we have to jump in earlier with incomplete information. To make up for that, we actually have to be better sense makers on the ground. We have to learn how to act, interpret, and adapt to things quicker and more effectively. And we have to do so in a way that doesn't paint us into a corner, but actually leaves us more options. Because in a world of the unknowns, options are more valuable than one certain bet, right? So we see this playing out in a number of ways through businesses. A personal example, I enjoy woodworking. I don't do much of it anymore, other than lucky enough to have my nephew Jack come over and share the shop with me from time to time. But when I was turning bowls, you start with an interesting piece of wood and a plan to turn it into a bowl, right? As the bowl moves around the lathe and the wood's chipping away, this interesting block of wood now reveals things you couldn't see from the outside. Oftentimes it would be a knot or a burl or some sort of hole in the wood. And so you're left with the choice as you're looking at that and working on it, saying, you know, is it something I want to minimize and work around, or it's something I want to accentuate and actually make part of the finished product in a unique and valuable way? For me, life's like that these days. I mean, you have to engage it. As you engage it, more is revealed. As more is revealed, you have to adapt to it. And these adaptations you have to do in a way that leaves you more options on the next turn, not less. So it's kind of what this is all about in many ways. In business, we've seen the same sort of examples of people applying this to their own circumstances. So in the lower right there, it's a CEO I was speaking with, and he said, given the choice now between more analysis and modeling or placing people closer to the customer and the locus of change, I now choose the latter. And he went on to say, similar to what we've been talking about. The world's changing fast, and he used the word, and it's unpredictable. And therefore, I feel much more comfortable if I can get people I trust close to where the change is happening, pick up on the weak signals, be making sense of things and why, and have greater feedback loops than having another group of people sitting somewhere analyzing what's going on from a faraway situation. So again, it's sort of this same notion of real-time sense-making and approximating our way forward. Another said they changed one of the most important processes in the entire company. He said the strategic planning process, a hallmark of analytics, has taken a dramatic turn from analysis and modeling towards defining and running a number of experiments. And he used experiments, the plural, very purposefully, because what he said was, and what we're seeing across many of the companies we're working with, what he said was that it's not about, again, spending all the time planning and then one big bet. You actually spread your risk and create optionality by having more experiments running. We're not actually sure which ones are going to work. Again, we jump in and move in the right direction, then successively approximate our way forward in a number of experiments. Sometimes the ones that we find work, we would have never bet on, but they're the ones that actually work for a variety of reasons. So throughout, these examples are illustrative of many of the other things we're hearing in business these days, which basically comes down to the following. More and more leaders are waking up and recognizing the fact that winning, innovating and winning will be more about engaging, not studying the problem, and experimenting and iterating, not modeling the answer. And so for us as leaders around the world, and what we've been helping people try to do is to follow the following two elements. if we're going to actually be successful in this new normal of constant disequilibrium, it requires us to do two things. First, have the courage to overcome some of the normal managerial instincts, to go back to the models and the ways we've done things, let those go and jump in with a little less information and jump in a little bit earlier. So that's the first, and that takes some courage. The second is to actually practice and hone these skills of real-time sense-making. This ability to act, interpret, and adapt faster in shorter cycles. We believe that practicing these things will actually be the hallmarks of the leaders who succeed in this new normal. Thank you.